Thank you very much, Sam, for agreeing to chat with me, and congratulations on The Haunted Wood. Right at the back, you have, can you remember the first time you fell in love with a book? It's an easy question for me to ask that to you. When was the first time you fell in love with a book? Do you remember that?
Well, I wish I could say I remembered a single one, but I have a very strong memory of reading some very generic, I think, version of the story of Robin Hood, which is obviously very well known in the UK. I don't know how much that travels to India, but, sort of British myth and legend about this hero who lives in Sherwood Forest and robs the rich and gives to the poor. And I remember reading this very generic version of this and absolutely collapsing in tears as a very young child at the end when Robin's on his deathbed and he fires his last arrow out of the window and it lands in the edge of the forest and he knows that's where he's going to be buried alongside Maid Marian. And it somehow... I realised then what it was to be moved by a book. And there are other examples too. I mean, a book by Dennis Watkins Pitchford, B.B., called Lord of the Forest, which bizarrely was a book about an oak tree, a single tree. The biography of this tree. The tree has a more exciting life than most trees, and, kings fleeing revolutionaries climb up it, and Robin Hood or similar hides in it, and it has quite a life. But again, the death of the tree at the end of that book kind of ended the 7-year-old me. So... I think a lot of what made me fall in love with books was realising how much they could move you.
Right. So it's not about comedy, but more about tragedy that you remember. Those are the ones that stay with us, I guess, because they move us as people.
I think so. I mean, of course, I remember the sort of joy and laughter to be had from, Dr. Seuss books, which were read to me when I was tiny, and the story of Ferdinand the Bull, and all of these things were sort of, and being slightly afraid, the spookiness of things like Where the Wild Things Are, Maurice Sendak's great classic. I think sort of there's a whole range of emotions that a book can give you, even as a child, and it's recognising that they have that power, be it to make you laugh, or to make you cry, or to make you feel the sort of tingle of excitement of travelling somewhere different, that, once that gets you, I think you're hooked.
And how much of a role did your father have to play when he may have read books to you, is what I would imagine. He was an actor, is what you write in the book.
That's right. Yeah, my father was an actor in his first career. He had several careers, and he gave up being an actor. It was his first love. He loved being an actor, and he dreamed of having a career as an actor, but he was practical, and he wasn't doing well enough. So he gave up in order to help support his family with something that would be more practical. But I think that once you've loved the stage and you've loved being an actor, that never quite leaves you. And I was aware that when he read to me as a child, particularly, and in the book I describe him reading to me from Kipling's Just So stories, the relish in the language, the doing different voices, all that stuff that an actor would do so well, he still had that, and it was still available for use, even if it wasn't there for the paying public.
Lovely. And I think kids do get used to dramatic reading. I have a 6-year-old, and I remember very vividly when he was 3, when I would read normally, because maybe after a long day's work, and he would say, read with some energy, read dramatically. So I think kids love that as well, don't they?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think children naturally, they thirst for the basic excitements of story, and the excitements of story have to do, of course, with what's in the story, as in, the pacing and what happens next and the chapter ends and the secrets and twists and surprises, but also those aspects of the story that a reader can bring out in terms of the wonderful sound effects and the colour of the characters and the different voices. And as a reader, you can add a lot to, or serve a text very, very well reading to a child, I think.
Indeed. In fact, I got introduced to podcasts of children's books quite late, and I was amazed. For example, Thomas and Friends, the railway series. So during COVID, I just subscribed to it, and I would hear just to see how well they do it, so I could replicate that when I would read to my kid. But in the end, my kid started loving those podcasts, although he doesn't listen to them as much. But the lilt in the voice and the way they tell the story, the words really come to life. So I think how we read to the kid who can't read yet is so important.
I think it's hugely important. It's important, I think, for 2 reasons. One of which is that, as we know, children who are read to are more likely to go on to read. They get their first introduction to the excitements and pleasures of storytelling. So it's a really important gateway to later literacy. But there's also this thing which I think is more important in our world, our modern digital world, than maybe even ever before, which is that you know when a parent is reading to a child, the child has that parent's undivided attention. Mummy and daddy aren't on their phone. They aren't half watching their emails. They're in the same moment with the child. So the cognitive work that's being done by, the storytelling is reinforced by this sort of emotional bond. As I say in my book, you really feel like you are, in Kipling's words, best beloved while you're being read to by a parent. And I think that's hugely important.
And you dive into the stories of the authors who wrote those children's books. And that was fascinating to me, because even as a kid, like whether it's Treasure Island or Winnie the Pooh that I'm reading to my kid, and the authors who wrote it have fascinating lives. Is that something that was the primary reason why you wrote it?
Well, I was interested, that's definitely a part of it. I was interested in where these stories come from, which of course is partly social and is partly personal and biographical and psychological. And I was interested in what they say to us about how we conceive childhood through the ages, because obviously children's stories are written by adults, and at every turn through history, they've reflected what adults think children might need or want or enjoy or need to be taught. And yet at the same time, which is a theme, so many of the people who've written so well for children have been people for whom childhood itself has felt like unfinished business. And that's meant that very often, the greatest children's writers have been people who've been almost trying to write a compensation for the sadness they've experienced in their own childhood. If they had a rotten childhood, they try and write an idea of childhood that's somehow going to kind of re-enchant what they missed out on. Well, that's, sometimes the people who had wonderful childhoods but found it very hard to grow up and didn't thrive in the adult world. So people like Kenneth Grahame, the author of The Wind in the Willows, who really had a very idealised memory of his own childhood, but he struggled with adult life, and he kind of creates this golden afternoon in The Wind in the Willows, which is a sort of escape or refuge from adult life. So often you find that these people are unusual psychologically. They're not all. They don't. I don't want to suggest that you have to be kind of mentally traumatized to write well for children. There are lots of very well balanced children's authors, but certainly it's a theme in a lot of them that childhood itself was troubled for them.
I've picked up a few books after having read your book, and one of them being Wind in the Willows, which I hadn't known it existed until now, and I look forward to reading it, because now I have an excuse. Because and another thing, right? Because when you have kids, you don't want them to grow up too soon, and you want to enjoy that bit with them, because it lets you let your hair down without embarrassment and without judgment. And one way of doing that is to read to them, and it doesn't matter whether you're silly or not.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's one of the things that I found consistently fascinating about this subject all the way through, is the realization, people sometimes say, or appear to give the impression that children's writing is sort of less interesting than literature for adults, and is less important and less complex and less serious. I think it's more interesting, more important, because everything else is built on top of it, and more complex, because in children's writing, you get this thing where they are spaces, imaginative spaces, in which, as I see it, children and adults meet. And they meet almost coming in opposite directions, because for an adult, as you described so well, to read a children's book is to enter this imaginative space where you're kind of free from adult life. It's a refuge. It's an escape from adulthood and grief and responsibility and different. You're suddenly in this exciting, wonderful, full of possibilities childhood world. But for children, it's freedom too. They're allowed to imagine a world in which they have more freedom to act, in which magical things will happen to them. They imagine themselves to be the protagonists of these stories, and generally the protagonists of these stories are having exciting adventures, which most children, if we're looking after them right, aren't having much in the way of exciting adventures, because we keep them safe.
Yes, true that. And writing for children, I would have imagined by default people know that it's a tough one, but not everybody believed that. You quote someone, I don't know who now, they said that writing for children is like writing for dummies, and then you obviously go on to say that that's not true.
The writer I reproach for that, and it's a writer of whom I have the utmost respect, is the late Martin Amis. And I think he was being flippant, but he said, somebody asked him, Sebastian Faulks, another novelist who's making a television programme about fiction, asked Martin, would you ever write a children's book? And Martin said, only if I got a severe brain injury. Now, he went on to clarify that by saying, well, I see writing as freedom, and anything that constrains that freedom would be intolerable to me. And in the sense that obviously if you're trying to write something available to children, there are certain restrictions on the level of vocabulary you can use and various other things. But I think the idea that children's writing is a sort of brain damaged or defective version of the adult sort is a very thin and silly one, fundamentally, and it sells short not only the importance of this stuff, but I think its complexity. And many of the great writers for children, and I think of people like Philip Pullman and Alan Garner among those, are writers who actively disavow the idea they're doing something special for children. They say, I'm writing what I want to write, and it's available to as many people as possible. And in most of these stories, I think, you can find an enormous amount, and you'll find different things depending on whether you come to them at the age of 5, at the age of 10, at the age of 15, or at the age of 50. And certainly for me, rereading a lot of children's stories, or reading for the first time a lot of children's stories while writing this book, I know that there were some of those stories that hit me emotionally really hard in a way that they wouldn't have hit me when I was a kid, because a lot of them are about childhood and childhood ending, and the emotional punch of those themes to do with time is much deeper when you're approaching middle age or you're in late middle age and you know what's at stake.
I remember one book, but I think it's there here somewhere. Kafka wrote a letter to a girl who complained that her doll was lost, and he writes to the girl as if the doll is now on a vacation someplace. Do you know that?
That does ring a bell.
Yeah, and then he in the end, and he's dying himself because he's coughing a lot, etc. And then he leaves a little note inside the doll, which the girl discovers many years later, and she says that what is more important is the experience that you have while you are growing up, rather than clinging on to things. Or I'm muddling the moral here, but when I was reading that to my son, knowing fully well how the book was going to end, even as an adult you feel moved, and I'm sure my kid doesn't understand any of those emotions, because, or sometimes I shouldn't underestimate 3-year-olds or 6-year-olds, but yes, as an adult some of these books can move you.
Well,
I agree
absolutely.
with you.
And I think that, I mean, the theme of so many of them in some ways is sort of time, and I think that's because they're written by adults for children, so they're always encapsulating an adult idea of childhood, and it's often quite a mournful one, because it's one that's the adult writing the book is remembering his or her own childhood, and kind of in some sense grieving the loss of it. And so if you read something like Philippa Pierce's Tom's Midnight Garden, which has an absolutely kind of tear-jerking last couple of pages, or Watership Down, the great epic novel about rabbits, where the closing pages sort of look back from a generation later, or nearly a generation later, on the events of the main book. But of course, being rabbits, it's only about 6 months. And those sort of emotional currents, I think do hit adults harder, but they also touch children. So it's you're meeting. There's a whole lot going on in these stories.
Yes, and it's not like the book is for a kid. As you said, they write a book, and is that what makes some authors better than others? That irrespective of the age that you pick them up, you still resonate with them, or you don't see that there's children's books, but they're just books. Yeah,
I mean, I don't feel it's. I mean, obviously, children's book as such is a kind of publishing category that only really came into its own in the early 20th century, and I mean, I don't quite hold with the idea that it's meaningless to talk about children's writing. It seems to me very obvious, and even some of the writers for children who tend to disavow the title of children's writer would concede that there are certain things you probably won't put into a book that's intended to be available for children. But I think the idea is that a book is available to children should be seen as an enlarging thing rather than a restricting one. If it's good, it will have something in it for people of all ages, and it will have a wider possible audience. I don't think it's the case that, and Catherine Rundell has made this case very well in her book, Why You Should Read Children's Stories Even Though You're So Old and Wise, that the idea that once you pass the age of 12, or whatever it is, children's books have nothing to offer you is a foolish one.
I'll tell you what, I was embarrassed once, and here there is a book called Pig the Grub. It's about a pig who keeps running from his family or his mom, and because he doesn't want to wash himself, and he's playing with muck and, his poop, which, by the way, authors
very
of,
like my own
three-
children. It doesn't need to be a pig.
And some of the vocabulary there, I learned, when I was in college. Now, it's down to my lack of vocabulary then, like things like rancid, rank, or little things like stench. He reeked, he was rancid, in short, he was rotten, etc., etc. So I think the expectation, I'm talking as an Indian now in India, we got introduced to certain words when I was preparing for my GMAT or GRE. But here's something that is very naturally used, and when you look up these meanings in the dictionary, you realize that they have been used in exactly the right context. And the word rancid had to be there and not stench or rank or,
Yes, I don't think we need to be... I think children's books, the great ones, can be ambitious in that they can challenge children. They can use an unusual vocabulary item, and if they're using it correctly and the context is right, the child will be intrigued rather than put off, and will learn something, and will move on. And likewise, if something like, right at the beginning of the modern tradition of children's writing, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, that is absolutely full of jokes that really are quite sophisticated. I mean, some of them are so sophisticated that you need to have a sort of undergraduate degree in mathematics to understand them.
Okay.
And so, they're simply saying, look, we're broadcasting on several wavelengths, and there's no reason that, just let the audience take from it what they will.
You took me back to 6th grade. Now, please let me know if my teacher was right. She told us that we had a small chapter. I haven't read Alice in Wonderland in its entirety, but we had a chapter, and somebody asks someone, who's your teacher? And the other person says, of course, it's Tortoise is my teacher. And we used to pronounce tortoise as tortoise. And our teacher corrected us in saying that the joke here is that tortoise, and that's why she is, that, tortoise is our tortoise. Tortoise is our teacher. So is that something, would that be right? And if so, I found it fascinating.
Well, tortoise and tortoise, as far as I can tell, are in free variation across the English-speaking world. There are UK dialects that pronounce it tortoise, and I guess there are Indian English dialects that will pronounce it tortoise. But I think in Carol, speaking RP, and the joke becomes tortoise to rhyme with taught us. I think you're right. Though that's a joke I'd missed.
And I think these are a couple of things that I'm quoting from your book, and that's what I like. You talk about storytelling, and you say that human beings are storytelling animals, and it is out of the stories we tell ourselves that we make sense of the world. And when you're a grown-up, I like this one too, the years go by like telegraph poles glimpsed from the window of a high-speed train. When you're a child, a summer takes a decade. Beautifully put.
Thank you. It was very, very much how I felt, having been a child and now being past the age of 50. Those telegraph poles are whipping by, and I do remember that point at which you'd leave school for the summer holidays and it would feel like you were never going to go back to school.
Yeah, and that's why I guess the childlike, even in the corporate world, they say you need to have a childlike curiosity in things, etc. We use it frivolously, but the whole idea is that you need to ask questions. And you refer to a neurological explanation in the book briefly as well, where while adults are focused on one thing, children are different. How are they?
Well, I am fascinated by this, and I put it in a very sort of, as you say, quite a passing mention in the book, because I'm not writing a book about the neurobiological cognitive basis of childhood, but a book by a very preeminent child psychologist called Alison Gopnik, which, what's the wretched book called? I can't now remember. The Philosophical Baby, is it called? I can't remember. Anyway, Alison Gopnik's book.
Right.
Where she describes how she says that the consciousness of children is different for good adaptive reasons to the consciousness of adults, and that adults learn to have an extreme focus on their goals and ideas, and they kind of disregard, extraneous inputs, which means that they're essentially, we go through life in a very energy efficient way. The simplest explanation is normally the best one. If we see something 100 times, we expect that next time, we work on the assumption that that's what's going to happen. So we use these sort of rules of thumb that make quick decisions. Whereas children's consciousnesses are what she calls a lantern consciousness. It's not like a kind of torchlight, which is zeroing in on the next objective. It's, a child's, will simply asked to solve a problem, I don't mean literally asked to solve a problem, but, deciding, trying to make some decision about the world, will test and imagine every single hypothesis, however improbable. We'll take in all the data available. We'll think about absolutely everything, because it'll take hours to take it in. But, we'll therefore be enriched by that. But they'll be pretty useless at jumping out of the way if a tiger comes to attack them, or they'll be pretty hopeless at hunting, or, doing any of the things that you need to do to survive, because children, she says, evolutionarily, we've adapted to look after our children, for them to be basically helpless for 6 or 7 years, like a baby giraffe. It's alive for 3 or 4 hours, and it's on its feet, and it's running around the place, and if something tries to eat it, it'll run away. Whereas human babies are helpless for much, much longer. And she says that that's an evolutionary trade-off, that, we allow them to sit there contemplating the beauty of every blade of grass, or thinking up a million different impossible things before breakfast, and we keep them safe because that allows their brains to develop in all sorts of ways that a giraffe's brain never will. But the trade-off is that we're helpless and quite vulnerable for a really long time.
She calls it the R&D, you quote, and the R&D department of the human species.
Yes, exactly. Research and Development Department of the Human Species. And that's a very good way of putting it. She's just like, they are what's sometimes called a skunk work. So the idea that they're the people, the child's brain is doing the totally outside the box thinking, and adults are doing the inside the box thinking. But, the child's brain will produce things that an adult brain will not. I mean, I love that what she says by implication is that, giving a child LSD will have almost no impact on it, because their brains are already like that. LSD works on the adult world by erasing all those fixed tracks of thinking we've got and throwing us back into this childlike lantern consciousness way, which is why someone who's tripping on acid, will spend half an hour contemplating the bark of a tree trunk very happily. But with children, that's what their brains are like all the time.
They by default have trippy lives. I know a friend of mine who tells me, you should smoke up, he tells me, and talk to your kid, and you'll have a different experience altogether.
I think they might be right. I don't want to turn this podcast into a kind of endorsement of psychedelic drugs in child rearing, but I think it's a really interesting question as to how different consciousnesses address the world.
No, but it's interesting how kids that age pick up on phrases in books that you read them and apply them in the right context. And I myself was fascinated, and here I'm not trying to praise my child, but he was at a swimming pool recently where he's learning how to swim, and he was being naughty. The coach said, your kid is a little naughty, but then he said, but he's learning well. I said, what happened? What did you do? He said, this other kid was trying to elbow me out. So what did you do? His response to me was, I sent him a message. I said, oh, what did you do? I punched him back, is what he said. But, so I told him 2 things, that the usage of the phrase, I sent him a message, 100 marks for that. But you don't go about punching people. But he must have read that somewhere. Because the whole idea that you send a message to someone in different ways.
Yes.
One being, in this manner is something that you read and you try and pick up. And that's why it's so important to expose them to the right kind of books, hopefully growing up. Is some of it sticks, and it's not a level playing field, or rather, when it comes to when you go to school, kids who are being spoken to more by their parents, whether in the mother tongue, English or whatever, tend to do well, because I'm assuming that some parts of your brain open up. The circuits are formed at that age if you introduce those things sooner.
Well, I think so, for sure. I mean, you obviously have a very clever kid, and one you wouldn't tangle with in a swimming pool to boot. But I think certainly, just exposing people as they're growing up to more language opens the brain up. I think it opens the brain up. It opens the circuits of empathy, because language, it's not a neutral kind of mathematical thing. It's a form of communication. You're always hearing it from somebody, so it's part of your social and emotional development as well as part of your cognitive development. And I think it is undoubtedly the case that children who are read to and spoken to and immersed in language and human contact flourish in all sorts of ways. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's really important in our modern age to not always just treat an iPad or a phone as a 24-hour childminder.
It's the best babysitter, is what somebody has.
It's a great babysitter, the one-eyed babysitter my parents used to call the television. But you have to be aware that it's not the only game in town.
You bet. And television was still a social experience, wasn't it? Like your parents and you, all of them would sit at one place and watch. The other day, somebody was telling me about two kids going on a sleepover, but when they opened the door, they found both of them were in their respective mobile phones. So that is not exactly a social experience, even if, I mean, TV is an idiot box, but smartphone is another level altogether because you are in your own world and it's not social at all. But we call it social media.
I agree with that. And I think, I have all sorts of problems with social media. I mean, adults can't really handle it, so I think social media for children is very anxious making and worrying. I mean, I think the idea that we are completely screen phobic, though, should be treated with caution because children interact with each other through video games in a way that, I mean, I'm of a generation where, our instinct is to say, well, when I was a kid, we used to go out and play football or cricket together, and that was what we did to socialise, and that was much healthier. And you're just sitting on screens, but very often they're sitting on screens, they're playing Fortnite or Minecraft, and they're using their brains, and they're on headsets, and they're interacting with their friends in a virtual world, which, though obviously they're not getting as much physical exercise as they were, seems to me to be just as wholesome in some senses as the football pitch or cricket pitch on which we played in real life as children. I think it's important not to be categorical about these things, and I think that there's great creativity and interest in some screen-based entertainments, but obviously, as you'd expect from someone who's written a book about childhood reading, I think that Dead Tree books and language storytelling remains very important.
Right, as long as there is a line, because you talked about playing football, you will have to come home when the sun goes down. But when you play video games, you could go on till whatever time, unless you have some adult supervision. But
you could. I'm an adult. I don't supervise myself, and when I'm playing video games, I go on long after the sun's gone down, and I hate myself for it.
The idea of childhood, and I found this to be quite interesting, is that the idea of childhood did not exist until a couple of 100 years ago, is what you write, that kids were expected to work the moment they could get their hands around objects. And tell us more about it.
Well, I mean, I reserve slightly from the very strong version of that position, which was famously stated by the French historian Philippe Ariès, medieval historian, who said, essentially, childhood did not exist before the early modern period. I think that's too strong a statement. It's plain that children had toys and children behaved in childish ways and have done ever since the dawn of time, and that their parents treated them differently than they treated adults. But I think it's true that for various reasons, some of them economic and developmental, for a lot of human history, childhood was essentially quite a truncated little stage where we went, the important thing is to get them through this quickly. And as soon as they are capable of working or fending for themselves or moving on to adult life, they need to. And it's only when you start to get, the idea that education rather than work is what needs to happen between late infancy and early adolescence. For a lot of human history, childhood was a luxury we couldn't afford. If you were a peasant, the moment you were old enough to toddle, you'd be looking after your younger siblings while your parents worked, or you'd be in the fields digging and hoeing, or you'd be, in a cotton mill or up a chimney. Or if you're an aristocrat, you'd be, 11, and you'd be married off to the Infanta of Castile to cement some sort of dynastic alliance. The idea that childhood would be it only comes in the Enlightenment, really. People start to think of childhood as this period that's precious in itself. And that has its own proclivities and opportunities and possibilities. And you start to get, with people like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a kind of association of childhood with innocence, with nature, and with play. And that's seen not as a kind of regrettable, why are children always playing when they should be praying or working, but a sudden kind of idea that this is something that's great and that's precious and that we should enjoy, and that, what's more, we should look back to with some regret as adults and hope to recapture, I don't think for most of human history people were keen to get in touch with their inner child.
Yeah. And I think that Rousseau is, if I'm pronouncing the name right, and he talked about how educators should focus on getting children ready to thrive as kids rather than preparing them for adulthood, which is what people before him did. Is that right? Yes,
I think that's right. It was saying, look, work with the grain of their nature. Realise that they will learn better what gives them pleasure. And Locke said the same thing. Rather than trying to sort of, and here is almost a cliche to say it, but the roots of the word education, educare, means to draw out. And they really went to town on that in the Enlightenment. They sort of said, look, it's not about cramming adult precepts and ideas and rules into children. It's about drawing out of their nature, what will help them to learn and develop according to their own natural proclivities and bent. And I think that was a real shift in the way we saw children. So, I mean, certainly as that tracks in children's literature, for, a couple of centuries, children's literature, at least in the UK, was in the hands of these extremely severe Puritans who started from the principle that children, when they were born, were essentially kind of radioactive with original sin. This Calvinist idea that in Christianity, in Puritan or Protestant Christianity, that children are the inheritors of a kind of humankind's original sin, and that they won't go to heaven, they won't be safe from the devil until they are old enough to repent and give themselves to Jesus. And so these children's writers were all like, okay, we need to save children's souls. And they set about trying to do so by scaring the wits out of these children. And so you get these sort of tracts which are all about how, children who die young it sort of sinks lives of children who are stricken by tuberculosis and die at the age of 10 but go to their graves embracing Jesus and repenting of playing knucklebones on the Sabbath or running up and down and being naughty and doing the things we now think are nice for children to do. And it's only in the kind of middle of the 19th century with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the books that came after that the idea that children's literature might be there to entertain children, to be funny and to be magical and surprising and naughty.
Yeah.
These things might be virtues of children's writing. That's when that comes in, and suddenly, all these very stiff, didactic books kind of fall quietly by the wayside.
I think laws also had a lot to do, right? And the infant mortality in 1840, right, at Manchester slums was 57%, so big number. And later, I think child labour was not desired but denounced. Because that's not how it started. So children possibly didn't have time. Would that be right to even worry about reading or somebody having to read them because priorities were different back then?
Yes, and that's part of the story as well. In order to have a kind of developed children's literature, you kind of need a market for it, which means you need, in the first instance, you need children who can read, or adults who can read to children. As literacy spreads and as universal education starts to become a possibility and then a reality, all of those things expand the pool of people who can digest this stuff, who are going to be interested in it, who are going to take an interest in children's literature. But as you say, also, you need separate spaces for children, which means the development of things like nurseries and middle-class homes. It means things like school. The more children who are going to school, obviously if you're at the age of 7, you're climbing up a chimney to be a chimney sweep, or you're working at a cotton mill, you're not going to have much time for reading and probably not much money for reading, and you're probably not going to be able to read in any case. So through the sort of 19th and 20th, early 20th centuries, 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries, you get a steady move towards, reducing child labour, encouraging children to go to school, and towards, as I say, conceptualising childhood as something that's a sort of worthwhile and separate sphere of life and cognition from adulthood. And so that all that goes hand in hand with the shifts in how children's literature addressed its audience and the audience it found.
And you also say that, and I read, Britain gave the world what you might call the ground zero of modern children's literature in the middle of the 19th century. Why is that, and how can you explain that?
Well, I don't know why that is, and I can't... I mean, I it's probably a rather arrogant thing to say the ground zero of modern children's literature when, of course, I don't speak... the vast majority of the world's languages. I'm not an expert on every... It may be that Russian or Indian or Taiwanese children's literature, was absolutely going gangbusters. But I think because Britain was an imperial power, the predominant imperial power at the point at which children's literature started to get going because of all the descriptions I've been talking about, it was in a position to have an outside amount of clout. And Britain has remained a world language, and the early children's literature certainly things like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and I think probably also the Water Babies and Kipling and Stevenson and, into the Edwardian period, things like Peter Pan, have become, absolutely global brands and have remained so. I think there are some things that are also distinctive about the UK tradition, and I've been, I was thinking about that a lot as I put the book together, because I realised, in some ways it's quite a narrow book because it is looking at the world through a British nursery bookshelf, that there are certain things that are mainstays, certainly of English language children's literature, which kind of would have had to come from the UK, one of which was the boarding school story, because they were such a big deal here, and as they aren't or haven't been in the rest of the world. And another one, of course, very conscious of the sensitivities of saying this to an Indian audience, that, the tales of imperial adventure. A lot of children's stories in the 19th century for the UK, and Kipling's a very good example, are telling a British readership, or an Anglo-Indian readership sometimes, about the exciting and strange things to be found when you travelled across the seas and went to India or to Africa or wherever, else in the world the UK had a colony. The people there are different, and they've got different coloured skin, and they eat different food, and there are all these strange animals. And so those stories of imperial adventure are a big part of the British tradition.
And sometimes I feel that Disneys of the world, for all their wanted prowess in terms of technology, ruin it on occasions when they don't get basic things like right. For example, the Jungle Book, which I enjoyed watching, but small thing, there's something called Bandar Log, which is a character, or it's actually a horde of monkeys. Now, Bandar in Hindi is monkey, and Log is men or people, but the character says Bandar Lag or something. When all it needs is to for you to pronounce it right, or to get a few things right, and you make a mention that the actual text and what gets shown on television these days, there is such a big gulf.
One of the big Disney emerges as a sort of villain in my book, because I actually think the Disney story of the Jungle Book is sort of great, but it bears very, very little relationship to what Kipling wrote in all sorts of ways. I love your pointing out that the film adaptation doesn't pronounce the Hindi right. There's a million other things it does wrong, but so many of these stories are more interesting than the Disneyfied versions of them, and are more complex, and there's sort of more to them. And I feel like Mary Poppins, Kipling. The thing that really irked me about the Kipling thing was actually it was a book, a physical book that I found when I was just starting to research this book, and I was obviously casting around the pile of children's books by my own children's bed, and I found this board book, which was a Disney board book, saying The Jungle Book, the original story. And it was Disney all over it, and it was Mowgli and a very simplified version of the Disney film. But anywhere on the copyright page, on the back on thing, did it mention the word Rudyard Kipling. And I thought, God, that's tragic. And of course, the Disney thing, as well as, mispronouncing Bandar Log and the, as I probably just have, and
you got it right.
And as well as the fact that, for example, Car in the book is an antagonist, where in fact Car is a friend in Kipling's stories. Kipling's stories, there are 2 Jungle Books. Only about half of the stories in them are even to do with Mowgli at all, and some of them are set, in the Bering Strait. Sort of one about seals. There's, it's just a very, very different proposition, and as I say, a much more interesting one, I think, than Disney's.
And another villain, or I want to seek your opinion on this. What about these sensitivity editors that have come in recently, that their job is to edit text from books that were written 60, 50, 90 years ago, because they may be too harsh for today's kids to read. Like the word fat is something that they got rid of in Roald Dahl's books. I think Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where one of the kids is really plump. And what's your view?
He's literally fat. He has to be fat for the story to work, because he has to get stuck in a pipe.
Yes,
he gets sucked in a chocolate pipe and gets stuck. So you can't. There's no real way around that. I've got slightly mixed feelings about the sensitivity editor thing, in as much as I don't like the way that argument has been sucked into at least in the UK, into a kind of culture wars template, where either you are woke and you're destroying great literature, or you're a reactionary bigot and there's no middle ground. It seems to me I mean, what was so laughable about the way it was done to Roald Dahl was that, as you describe so rightly, it was clumsily done and stupidly done, and it was kind of missing the point. But I think it seems to me that sometimes, and I really noticed this, and with some dismay as I was researching my book, that a lot of children's writing right up into the 90s, much later than I expected, was just slightly, what we now call low-key racist in the UK, in a way that, not vicious, not kind of white supremacist. I mean, there is some of that stuff in the 19th century, but G.A. Henty, for instance, it's very, essentially, isn't it fun to go to, anywhere in the British Empire and Tommy gun lots of the natives because these brown chaps don't deserve it. Most of it was just slightly off. The descriptions would be patronising, slightly racist, a bit difficult. Sometimes the vocabulary would just not be quite right. You'd get in even E. Nesbit, a sort of hand-wringing Jewish moneylender, or Chinese people with pigtails who'd speak in kind of, chinky-chonky language. All that sort of stuff that would just make us go, oof. Now, I think it's okay, it seems to me, to tweak it a little bit. And it's not an innovation to do that. For instance, Dr. Dolittle, which is a really very benign and lovable sort of series, Hugh Lofting's 1920s books about Dr. Dolittle. But in the first book, there is this subplot where he's in Africa, and there's a sort of whiteface thing where there's the prince of the local tribe, Prince Bumpo, I think he's called. And Dr. Dolittle agrees to make him white because he wants to be white, and he sort of smears him with chalk, and then the guy helps them along their way, and they go, oh, well, of course, poor chap, when he washes his face tomorrow morning, he'll realise he's still brown. He won't like that. And, it's not great. But for 40 or 50 years, most editions of that book have just quietly excised that subplot. And in the same way that I don't think it's an act of grotesque barbarism to change the title of Agatha Christie's, there was called 12 Little Niggers, to And Then There Were None. You take the N-word out of the title, you've still got the book, it's fine. So I think it's okay to do that on some level, because a lot of these stories, we should remember, aren't set in stone. Lots of them are very vigorous, and they're rewritten even during their own lifetime, and they jump from the page to the stage. They're not kind of fixed texts that are absolutely set in stone. So I sort of think it's all right in the same way that as an adult, when you're reading an old, maybe an Enid Blyton book or a Nancy Drew book or something, an old-fashioned children's book to your own children, you might come across a word or a line that you think, that's not how we'd say it now, and you'll just skip quietly over. And I think that's okay, but I do agree the idea that you kind of expunge everything and erase the history is sort of silly.
Because these days in corporate training programs, they talk about, you can't talk about people's physique, so much so that if there's a tall guy walking past you and if say, did you see XYZ? No, I don't know who he was. They won't say, was he tall, fat, short, because these days even these adjectives are frowned upon.
Yes, I mean, there's that, and that, all those things of, can you describe somebody as ugly? I mean, I think part of the difficulty you run up against is that even if you've got the best will in the world and all of this is being done from a place of great, wishing to protect children from body shaming or whatever it is, we have to remember that children's stories are still really plugged into their origins in fairy tales and folk tales and myths, and the connection between moral virtue and physical beauty, that witches are ugly and monsters are monstrous and princesses are beautiful and princes are handsome, all of those sort of values are right there in the fairy tale source material. And the sort of power and vigour of Roald Dahl, I think, and part of its transgressive power and vigour, is that he had that really old-fashioned kind of connection. He really just did enjoy having vicious, ugly, nasty, fat, horrible baddies and, slim, nice, good-looking goodies. That's obviously, there is no connection in real life between moral virtue and physical beauty, but it's there in the source material, and it's quite hard to expunge it altogether.
And even that's changed over the years, hasn't it? Julia Donaldson, I have her series of books, and there's a book around Zog the dragon where he goes on to rescue a princess or some such, and the princess says, I don't want to be just somebody who you rescue, and I'd like to be a doctor, and then the story goes on, and it's fun. The knight, I think, the knight and they get on a dragon and they go and rescue the world. So they're trying to defy convention that we know of, that princesses are meant to be recruited.
Also, I think that's a very good instance of the way in which storytelling can, again, the culture war take is that, woke people have no sense of humour and are destroying stories. Actually, often the funniest and wittiest of these books are the sort of so-called woke retellings, like Julia Donaldson there having the princess say, I'm not just here to be rescued. And The Paper Bag Princess and The Tough Princess are both books which, again, they're 30 years old now or something like that, and absolutely turn on their heads that idea that princesses are just sit there, lie there waiting to be kissed by a prince. So subverting those archetypes is something that books can take great pleasure in doing, and more power to them.
Yep, but some stories need to be changed, don't they? Grimm's, that is the Grimm's brothers' tales, some of them were horrific. Even as adults, it's hard for me to get my head around. If you remember, do you remember the little paragraph that you have in the book where you give an example? Tell us.
Yes, the children who played at slaughtering, which is one of the original from the very first edition of Grimm's Tales. It's a story about essentially two boys who watch their father slaughter a pig. They go, that looks like fun. One of them cuts the other one's throat. Their mother, who's upstairs bathing their baby sibling, hears the screams, comes downstairs, sees one of the children dead and the other one waving a knife. She grabs the knife, stabs the other boy to death. Then she goes back upstairs and discovers that the child she's left in the bath has drowned, so she kills herself. Then the husband comes home, discovers this scene of devastation, and I think either dies of grief or kills himself also. And that's the end of the story. It's not what you'd call susceptible to the Disney treatment. But I think the thing it's easy to forget, and the Grimms are a whole separate conversation, is that the Grimm brothers were not writing children's stories. Originally, they were essentially comparative sociolinguists or ethnographers. What they were interested in doing was collecting what they saw as a body of German folklore which would express the true Germanic culture before it was destroyed by industrialization and the arrival of the modern age. And I mean, the idea of trying to find a pure, true Germanic culture, obviously, this side of the 20th century looks a bit less attractive as a project than it did then. But they were basically doing something quite adult and anthropological. And it was only many, many editions of these folk tales down the line when they'd excised some of the weirder and darker ones. They'd made some of the endings less horrible. They prettied the stories up, and they gave them a sort of shape that their wild folkloric antecedents didn't have. And they started to kind of essentially domesticate them and turn them into what we now think of as fairy tales. Right. And at the same time, they did a sort of edition which had shorter stories and illustrations, and they suddenly realised, basically, suddenly children were interested in these things. Grimm's stories, which started out, as I say, as one sort of thing, ended up being fairy tales for children, but that's certainly not how they started out.
And when I read that story in your book, I wondered what is the point of that story. But the fact is that this is something that can happen in a world which is dark.
Yeah.
Not everything ends with, and they lived happily ever after.
No, exactly. That's certainly not. And all those sort of formulae like Once Upon a Time and They Lived Happily Ever After. I like that the Arabic version of Once Upon a Time is, say, there was and there was not, which captures that lovely kind of fictive liminal space between you're expected to believe this and you're not expected to believe this.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, we have to remember also that a lot of the things that give a little spine tingle to children were, at their roots, articulating some quite primal tribal fears. All those Middle European folktales, of which the Grimms are the kind of, great, I guess, exemplar. They're all about, you also find it in the Russian folktales as well, they're all about disappearing to the forest, and the forest is dark, and it's dangerous, and it's scary, hence the title of my book, The Haunted Wood. And it's where you find wolves and witches, and all the things that people in the village are frightened of. And so the forest as a transformative space, and as a space where there is danger but there's also agency and you come back from it changed, is such a profound archetype, I think, because, for our ancestors, that was literally it. The forest was where food came from, and it was where you might get eaten by a wolf, and you treated it with fear and respect, and the warm hearth in the village was the safe place, and the forest was not.
Yeah, and animals is another bit, right? In all these books where you have animals in the forest, you meet them, they talk. Stories historically have been told through animals, whether it's Winnie the Pooh, Christopher Robin, or so there are quite a few places where it's. And what was that? When did that start? And it's fun, even as adults, to read that. It doesn't seem odd.
Yeah.
At all. Yeah.
I puzzled about this a bit, I have to confess, because obviously one root of the sort of talking animal stories is Aesop. Aesop's fables, one of the kind of really original writers, not necessarily for children again, but there's this body of folklore attributed to Aesop, which is all about talking animals. And these animals have a kind of, they are sort of messengers from the divine in some ways, or they stand in for archetypes. So I think that feeds into it. But then you also have to look at somebody like Beatrix Potter, or even the animals in Alice in Wonderland. And they feel a bit different to me from the Aesopic animals. I mean, Beatrix Potter's animals, there's nothing, they're sort of, some of the, very often they're like little bourgeois late Victorian characters who just happen to be, badgers or voles or rabbits or whatever. But it does seem odd that's such a strong strand in the history of children's writing that we do see animals. I mean, because I don't think people were keeping pets in quite the way that we keep them now throughout human history.
You also write about how kids treat animals in their early years will go on to define whether they'll be decent human beings or serial killers.
Well, that's like, I've read a lot of serial killer, thrillers, and certainly it does seem to be the case that if you pull the wings off flies and stuck firecrackers up cats' bottoms at the age of 8, the chances are that you're more likely than your caring and tender contemporaries to end up, murdering people. I guess animals are an early instance of an opportunity to show and develop empathy. Right. We think of it that way, and in fact, there's one of those very early children's stories. I'm now trying to remember. I think it was Mrs. Fielding's. There's a story about which it tells a parallel story, sort of early 19th century, late 18th century story, which tells the parallel story of a family of humans and a family of robins who live next door to each other, and how they interact. So clearly there is a parallel being drawn there that goes right back.
Right, and last one is empathy you talked about, and it was pleasing to read that despite these authors being competitive, is what I would imagine at the time, there would be some sort of respect among them. And there is a little story that you have about Rudyard Kipling writing a note to, was it Christopher Milne, who wrote, talking about how good, talking about how a big fan that Kipling was of this other author,
I think there was an exchange, I think you're talking about, between E. Nesbit and Kipling.
Yes.
And
right. Okay. Yes.
She. I think he wrote. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but I think he wrote to her. She was a huge fan of him. He was from Generation Above.
Right.
And E. Nesbit, who wrote most famously The Railway Children, but also The Treasure Seekers and the Samiad, the story. And she.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you, but I think here's what your book says. Even Rudyard Kipling, still a towering figure in children's writing, wrote Milne, M-I-L-N-E, Milne. How do I?
Milne, A.A. Milne.
Milne, yes, Milne. A fan letter to which Milne responded, "If you can remember what you once said to Tennyson, you will know." And it goes on to say that what are the right exact words? Is when a private is praised by his general, he does not presume to thank him, but fights the better afterwards.
Oh, yes. No, that's a lovely exchange. I've forgotten about that. Yes, no, absolutely right. I think you put your finger on it when you talk about the cooperation and the respect, because a thing that's really moving to me in looking at the history of children's literature is how deeply and gratefully and very often openly the great children's writers acknowledge their predecessors and build on their work. And that goes all the way through. I mean, not just to folk tales and fairy tales, but you can see Kipling praising Milne, E. Nesbit praising Kipling, people like Jacqueline Wilson rewriting and reworking E. Nesbit, J.K. Rowling, gratefully and openly, acknowledging the influence of all sorts of writers who came before, that there's a sort of wonderful thread of these stories being passed over hand, and developed and changed and improved and argued with generation to generation. And that seems to me to parallel the way in which we pass them down as well. I mean, I find very moving that there are stories that my parents read to me as a child that I have read to my children when they were young, and that I hope that they will read to their children. But at the same time, in each generation, you acquire new ones as well. You know, you like my canon now, as yours does, includes Julia Donaldson's work, which of course wasn't there when I was growing up.
Yeah, and Harry Potter, how would you rate J.K. Rowling in your sprawling research? She will go down in history as what? Among the greatest of all time? Or did she get lucky at the time when, or not so much as compared to Blyton at the time, or Agatha Christie? This is because she stands head and shoulders above everybody else. How would you put her in this
I think
list?
She's very, very good. And I know there's a sort of fashion for knocking her, partly which is on the basis that, you know, some people disagree with her interventions on gender politics, which is a whole separate conversation I don't particularly want to get into because I think it's very irrelevant to the work itself. The work itself is... People sometimes complain that she's unoriginal, and in some senses she is, but I think one of the arguments in my book is that so much of the great children's writing is about collage, is about taking something and making it new, and she is fabulously good at that. I mean, I think that what the Harry Potter stories do is to almost look back over the whole canon of children's literature that's gone before them, and they pinch all the good bits shamelessly, and they go, right, we'll have this part of the school story, and we'll have this part of the kind of portal fantasy, and we'll have this aspect of the, you know, Cinderella, lonely orphan, turns out to have a historical destiny story. We'll pinch all these things and we'll make it new. You know, we'll take the fantasy bestiary of Tolkien and we'll add it to this and this and this. And in order to make that work, it's not just a question of taking the influences, it's a question of combining them in the right way. And that she did virtuosically, because she's very, you know, her prose isn't showy, but it does its work. The storytelling is on point, the pacing is great, the jokes, I think, are good, and the characterization is very effective. And, you know, her success was very undeniably not the result of publishing hype, certainly not to start with. It was a result of literally children in playgrounds, word of mouth. The children who read that first book, which was published to no great fanfare and in a relatively small first edition,
right.
The children who read it loved it, and they told their friends, and their friends read it, and their friends loved it, and that's why it sold a bazillion copies.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can take that away from her. And I think that she goes down in history as someone who changed the history of the genre in as much as she changed children's publishing. You know, she made such an impact, and she actually genuinely moved the publishing market, and children's literature was reinvigorated, and so many writers who've come after. Some of them, on the face of it, more sophisticated writers, could not have found their place in the world without her. So I think all credit to J.K. Rowling.
And Sam, credit to you as well. Congratulations. Your book was voted as among the top 5 non-fiction books by The Economist of 2024. It was out, so congratulations.
Thank you.
To you, Sam. And
very honoured by that.
Yes, and thank you so much for your time on this one. We could go on for a bit, and it's already a little over an hour. And this is the book, The Haunted Wood, A History of Childhood Reading. Beautiful. Thanks for writing it, and thanks for explaining this in a language which is fun and engaging. Thanks a lot, Sam, for your time.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.